much. This is the foundation session. It was started, Gabriel Shalansky, when he was in the leadership of the Knowledge and Innovation Group, had this idea to have these more informal conversations with the people who have really shaped our field, who everyone's really interested in kind of how did these foundations get laid down, where do the ideas come from, where are they going. And at that time, the Knowledge and Innovation did a survey of the membership, and one of the things we asked was, who really has been influential in shaping how you approach your research? And we've talked to a number of people, and we're really lucky to have now, today, Dan Levinthal, is someone the membership kind of overwhelmingly reported as really important to the kind of work they're doing today. This is, as you see, and as we've been fussing with, it is being recorded. The video goes up on the SMS website, and we'll put kind of announcements of it on the Facebook page, and we have a LinkedIn page for Knowledge and Innovation. If you're interested in the prior sessions around foundations, there were conversations with Sid Winter, with Linda Argotti, with Rob Grant. I think last year was Mike Tushman. So some of the other folks are up there. The full interviews and conversations are there. We are lucky enough today to have two PhD students from INSEAD, Amy Zhao and Leena Hans, are going to have actually been having conversations with Dan to set up what they'll talk about today, and they're going to take it from here. So thanks all for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you everyone for joining us today to explore Dan's academic journey. I'm Amy Ding Zhao, and this is my colleague Leena Kinga-Hans, and we are second-year PhD students at INSEAD. So we're very honored to have Dan as our guest today for the interview. We have been preparing in the past few months, and we come up with this roadmap of Dan's key events and important influences in his career. Yes, and which we will discuss further shortly. We will also categorize Dan's work into important theoretical themes, and yeah.
Looks like my DNA or something. I don't know quite. You really got down to the roots here.
Yes, and we will also show these ideas Dan came up with and how it's influenced by these existing concepts from behavioral theory and complexity theory, and how these ideas themselves evolve and are connected to each other. So for those of you who are interested in knowing more about these maps, we will share this presentation afterwards. So we would also want to thank the scholars who contributed to this slideshow some of you just saw before we start the session. Some weeks ago, we asked the important people in Dan's lives to give their impressions on Dan as a student, as a colleague, as a mentor and a friend. And we got these amazing quotes from distinguished scholars, including James March, Wesley Cohen, Mark Fishman, Linda Argotti, Henry Greva, Panish Puranam, Sandil Israj, Giovanni Gvadi, and others. Due to time limitations, we wouldn't be able to show each of them today, but I have to say, all of them are inspiring and touching and sometimes poetic. So they will also come to the presentation, and videos will produce later. Dan is also seeing this for the first time. I hope you like it as a surprise gift. You will see it maybe later after the session. But this map and the collection of quotes are our way of saying thank you for the inspiration to the field and also to our own studies. So welcome, Dan.
Thanks so much.
So we will start with some questions about the background. So as a scholar, you have been working on different streams of research. You've been doing studies in learning, research, adaptation, selection, technological change, etc. So now looking back, how would you see if there are any common threads, or how do you see the dots in your net being collected?
Right. So I guess if you want to go way, way back to the origin story, I'm a child of Silicon Valley in some sense. My dad was a faculty member at Stanford. I grew up there in the 1960s and 70s. At a time when the Valley was moving from its primary industry of orange production to becoming Silicon Valley. So in some sense, and my dad had some involvement in that, so this kind of idea of the Schumpeterian dynamics were kind of imprinted. So thinking about adaptation, technological change were kind of, in some sense, natural callings for me from that starting point.
I mean, decision making has always been a theme in your study. So it sort of comes from this rational thinking to a behavioral thinking. So you started out as economist.
Yeah.
You get your undergrad study in economics from Harvard in 1979, and you go straight to Stanford with a PhD in economics.
Right.
So how did you make the switch?
Yeah. So, slightly informed, naive young person, interested in the social sciences. I like modeling. The answer to those two propositions seems to be economics. And then in my junior year as an undergraduate, I wandered into a sociology class taught by a freshly minted, a new assistant professor, a guy named John Padgett. And it was a course on organization sociology. It was really quite a remarkable experience. First week of class, kind of big lecture hall like this. After 1 week, John had whittled it down to about an 8-person seminar, 2 of whom were PhD students, and just amazing reading lists, right? So he had just come from Michigan, and we're reading working papers by Nelson and Winter, Axelrod and Cohen. He's taken us through the whole Carnegie iconic works, March and Simon, and Started March. And so that was a big wake up for a undergrad economics student. And I thought, wow, this sounds interesting. And I almost went to Yale, this econ to study with Nelson and Winter. It seemed, okay, that would be a natural halfway. And then I had this basically foolish idea, I'll go to a business school because it might be easier to integrate those different strands. The Stanford Business School at that time was among the exciting currents. Agency theory is really taking hold. The econ program, so I kind of a legacy effect. I'm a still had that identity, very math, econ oriented, and I kind of then would moonlight with Jim March and began to do some work with him.
But clearly the switch gave you a very different perspective on both economics and management. I remember you mentioned somewhere that you had an outsider perspective on economics, and that's where the idea of absorptive capacity came from. Would you like to talk a bit more?
Sure. So there is, maybe, I felt like some ways, these two did amazing work, okay? Kind of sense making about as I teased them, I said, I felt like it was kind of like an academic therapy session. Oh, now I understand how all these things go through. And actually prove that, right? Oh, Dan, you're once again the outsider, and you kind of like being the outsider, right? You're not the economist. So I had this odd PhD training, and just actually build a little on that, and shows my incredible career foolishness. So I accepted a job at Carnegie, which in itself was not foolish, a wonderful place. The foolish part was I accepted a position that was joint economics and organization behavior. So I was actually, in the fall, I taught microeconomics. In the spring, I taught organization behavior, and by my third year, they needed a strategy person. But back to your kind of more specific question then, so I had this mixed background. In my slightly paying attention to my students as I'm proctoring an exam, I'm reading a back issue of Econometrica, and there was this lovely article by Michael Spence on spillovers. And it's a nice model, and he ends the model with this puzzle. Given this effect of spillovers, why are we seeing in the semiconductor industry all this kind of R&D, innovative effort happening? I'm thinking, well, I know, because I'm interested in learning. If you ran up and told me some deep, dark secret about Intel's processes, it would still be a deep, dark secret. I have no idea what you're talking about. So it seemed so self-evident by being conversant, being able to engage in their conversation, but not being a part of it. And so it's sort of, it was clear to me just putting down the article, if I introduced, what I then later termed absorbed capacity, another consideration, I could kind of qualitatively flip the sort of results that Spence was talking about. And then I went to have lunch with my friend Wes, and Wes got excited, and that particular journey went forth.
You're no longer an outsider to the Economic Journal because, as most of you would know, Dan's article on innovation and learning, 2 sides of R&D, which was published in '89, was republished this year by the Economic Journal to celebrate its 125th anniversary. And it was selected as one of the top 13 most influential articles. And so that's not an outsider's article. But like we had a question from the audience on what do you think is the future of absorptive capacity?
Right, right. So I have to say that was one of, there's been lovely, this is lovely, to be listed on the same table of contents as John Maynard Keynes. Oof. A humbling experience. But so what do I think it's going forward, its influence? I think in some ways it's, one thing that struck me, I'm not going to let go of this outsider sensibility. So, but as an observer of the discussion in this arena, clearly there's a lot of interest and excitement about open innovation in the world and our literature for quite appropriate, sensible reasons. And it strikes me that perhaps in our enthusiasm around that, we're maybe recommitting perhaps the sin of neoclassical economists who are thinking about innovation, that, this is not the market for pork bag futures, okay? It's a complicated thing. So can potential buyers of the IP contextualize it? How do I articulate it as a seller? And so certainly there are things like Netflix can run their prize competition that are very well-defined engineering problems. Can you come up with an algorithm that does better at predicting matching than our current one? But I think that consideration, maybe it's a new opportunity for it to express itself. At the time Wes and I did that work, in a similar vein, there was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm around joint ventures and alliances. The implication from our work was often managers were framing those as substitutes for internal capabilities. And obviously the absorbed capacity argumentation suggests a kind of complementarity. And so in this interesting new brave world of open innovation and so on, what's the viscosity of knowledge? How does it move? How do people understand and represent these opportunities and possibilities are still very, very much important.
Interesting questions for budding scholars and how to take absorptive capacity forward. We'd like to talk a little bit about your early Stanford days,
Okay.
1980s. Clearly very rich organizational work happening at that time, and a lot of imprinting might have taken place. How did that influence your future work?
So, I'm having my Friday wine with Jim. We're doing some work, so there's clearly the marching imprint. I was really fortunate that just by chance, one of Jim's early students, Michael Cohen, parachuted in for maybe my first or second year on his sabbatical, and I got to know Michael, and he started, some of his sensibilities started to influence me. And in the broader context of Stanford at that time, the population ecology body of work was getting going with Michael Hannon, and Glenn Carroll was just finishing up as a doctoral student. Actually, at one point, Jim did a little matchmaking. I think Glenn was just about to leave. He actually had already had his job, but we started, Glenn and I should meet with him occasionally. And so he was trying to, so this kind of, bringing to bear both the adaptation and selection and some sensitivity. So I wasn't part of the population ecology community, but certainly aware of that work and appreciating its possibilities.
We figured you would mention Jim March as an influence, and we have a few words from Jim March there, and we have to tell you this. So we asked Jim March to send us 1 or 2 lines about Dan, and he refused. He said, I can't write about Dan in 1 or 2 lines, and I need 16 lines to talk about Dan and to do justice to the relationship that he and Dan had, and we're just waiting for those words to come up. Very, very endearing words from a mentor and a friend and a colleague later on.
Father figure.
Yeah, I think those words also reflect that father figurely kind of a feeling. Could we have that, or?
So I was very blessed. I can tell you on the sort of small world front. So, whether his comments actually first met Jim at my parents' house because his wife Jane and my mom were friends and would take walks together. So while in parallel I was sort of getting exposed to his work, I was kind of cognizant of that. And so, and then on top of my kind of proper RA-ship, kind of did begin to do some work with Jim early on. There's that smiling face.
So he mentions you're a profound contributor to organization studies, and he will not try to list his contributions, but they're too numerous for a short testimonial. He has an extraordinary gift for identifying little features of organizational life that have major consequences, for specifying those features precisely, and for articulating the implications. In that spirit, I know very few ideas from any source that have had an effect comparable to that of the idea of absorptive capacity we were talking about earlier, that he and Wes Cohen introduced some years ago. In another place recently, I said Dan was a good physicist with a touch of a botanist. For me, however, Dan is much more than an exquisite scholar. He's a mensch, that marvelous Yiddish word that identifies someone we admire and seek to emulate, someone with integrity, responsibility, and a strong sense of what is right. I once unsuccessfully picked a candidate wife for Dan. If I'd had an eligible daughter or granddaughter, I would have tried to get her married to Dan, though I'm conscious of his ability to decline his suggestions with consummate grace. Most of all, he's a friend, a man who makes my life better. Were it not true that his father and mother are longtime friends of mine, I would claim him as a son with all the pride that a father can have and all the love.
Oh, that's
Beautiful words.
very
We were
great,
very
thank you.
inspired.
Yeah.
that's I mean, Jim, as so much of what I understand about organizations, modeling, and life comes from my experience relation with Jim.
Yeah. So you have been quite specific about the distinction between learning and adaptation. The work you did with Jim, myopia of learning, show the traps of learning and also sometimes may not lead to successful adaptation. So how did those thoughts about adaptation come to place and evolve?
So I think, and maybe as you were kind of already getting at that kind of being aware of the population ecology work, yes, that's all about pure selection, and I'm doing learning kind of modeled with Jim. Sensitive to the interplay of those processes. And I think also Michael Cohen's kind of early imprint by giving me my winter break reading of John Holland's Adaptation in Natural and Artificial Systems, which is not the easiest way to spend a December break, but quite squarely puts up kind of these ideas, and central to Holland's writing is the exploitation trade-off consideration. And so those dual factors, and certainly this, as you prefigured, learning can be a change in the stimulus response pattern, but let's not imbue that necessarily with some normative, inevitably this is putting us on a better path. And so to distinguish between that change in those patterns as important construct and phenomena versus adaptation. And then also clearly this interplay between adaptation and selection mechanism.
So would you say that you would see selection and adaptation as two sides of the same coin in that sense? Also, we received an audience question on what do you think as the micro foundation of industry evolution? So do you think your thoughts about selection, adaptation offers a different lens on industry evolution?
So taking the first part of that, clearly it seems to be two kinds of interplay. So one is selection at one level may suggest adaptation at a higher level, right? That's what the population ecologists would tell you. Okay, we have this whittling of organizational demography that's leading to population change. I mean, at some level, you could even think about your pattern of stimulus response learning is I am selecting among my action repertoire based on feedback. I mean, it's a kind of a selectionist. So the levels of analysis matter. Furthermore, at a point I kind of in a crude way just put out qualitatively in that very special org science issue in 1991, a little essay, that if you're going to have a selection process, underneath that needs some fairly stable basis of heterogeneity, and that the learning and path dependence associated with that is really the sort of fodder over which selection might occur. With regard to this sort of broad question about, I was also very imprinted early on, as an undergraduate with the Nelson and Winter work on evolutionary economics, which was, very much about taking adaptive system sensibility to the issues of industry dynamics. And it seems to me, fairly generative, promising approach. We don't reach equilibrium in a twinkling eye, and indeed the context keeps on changing. So it seems like a kind of a useful structure. I don't want to get too seduced down this path. It's a longer conversation, but clearly the issue then is, what are the underlying micro units of analysis? What's the basis of the path dependence? And I think there's still lots of opportunities for theorizing and empirical work on that front. I don't think we've really resolved that to a particularly satisfying degree.
So in your 1997 piece, Adaptation on Rugged Landscape, you used the Kaufman NK model and apply it to the study of organizations. So would you share with us how did that happen?
Right. So part of their team, that as they had these conversations with me, I realized, and they were got me sort of the not random, but certainly a lot of elements of happenstance. Why did I do this? And then I tell these particular stories. And yes, there's some underlying continuity of, perspectives and interests. But in terms of the happenstance, so at some point in the mid 90s, early 90s, Michael Cohen organized a really wonderful workshop at the Santa Fe Institute. And it was an interesting mixture of the Santa Fe folks, the physicists and chemists and so on, and a few organization theorists. And the clever design that Michael used was a mix and match. So the Santa Fe people would present an organization paper and vice versa. So the physicist presented Jim's, just kind of come out recently, exploration exploitation paper. And he goes, kind of interesting spin glass model, there might be something to it. And Jim is politely sitting there. And then as I think still untenured faculty, my job was, this MacArthur Award-winning guy, Stu Kaufman, he has this stuff on NK. Dan, here's a pile of papers. Why don't you talk about it? And it took a little time sort of processing that. I thought, wow, this is really an interesting way. Organizations are fundamentally about interdependent actions. Here's a kind of nice framework. The Nelson and Winter ideas of routine seem to be would be a natural implication of some of the dynamics here. So I got exposed and incubated with that. Kaufman in his work, so Stu was committed to thinking about how these proteins organize. He didn't have selection. But for my perspective, this could be a kind of really great basic engine and let me introduce selection. And in some sense, it allowed me to, among other things, in a much more rigorous, clear way, do what I was talking about, that 91 piece. Okay, here we see the path dependence, we see the stable heterogeneity over which the forces of selection are going to operate. And we've been talking about the literature, local distance search. Here's a way for me to kind of put some kind of clarity on it. So it was a lovely happenstance, and as we were joking, the fortune favors the prepared mind, right? There's luck, and are you predisposed or have some existing ideas that might be useful in that context?
So we actually have another quote from Panish. He's saying that rugged landscape paper reignites the use of formal computational models in our area. So what do you think was the key message of that paper?
Well, I think, in terms of, so I had my uses of it, okay, as I kind of just noted. I think, why it took on greater energy in the field, as a modeling platform, you're looking for canonical representation of important phenomena, right? And so the prisoner's dilemma, what are there, 1,000 papers, some in psych, some in economics. This is a canonical representation to kind of think about some issues around conflict, right? The N-armed bandit is the canonical representation to think about exploration and exploitation. Not that you can't think about it in other venues, but here's a very stripped down. And I think people saw the NK as, okay, we talk about organizations of these interdependent systems, and here's this fairly simple, abstract vehicle to do that. Now, I also realized, having written after I wrote a couple papers, it occurred to me, particularly actually the work with Gavetti, is, the NK, as set out by Kaufman, is a kind of interesting degenerate case, okay? That if you think about Simon and the science of the artificial, systems are likely to have some inherent structure. And so then, the subsequent work I did with Sendell Etheridge on modularity, and other people started to go, okay, here's a platform, and we begin to tweak it in some ways to speak to these kind of issues. But I think it, has that possibility as a basic platform that people can use to speak to a number of kind of important organizational questions, quite apart from the specific contribution of the 97 piece.
So the NK model was like one of the many examples in which you used formal modeling and simulation. And we also have an audience question that asks about what do you think is the role of formal modeling in organizational studies, and what do you think are the benefits and challenges of it?
I think the formal modeling is a way to engage in theorizing, right? So we have some primitives, they have some non-trivial interactions. Let's turn this crank, let's understand better these phenomena, these processes. I think formal modeling, though, in that same spirit, it's incumbent on the modeler to make that connection to the underlying phenomenon, right? So models that just speak to other modelers are not going to be so well cited and shouldn't be so well cited. I was noting at a session earlier this morning, my presumption is readers of my work in most cases won't go beyond section 2. Okay, so yes, I've done this formal model. I've used that to help sharpen my insight and be able to generate some qualitative insight about the world. And now it's incumbent on me to then express it in a manner that's accessible to, and it is evocative for a broad audience. So I think, it is that's part of the modeler's responsibility. That's not the, oh, those silly empiricists didn't look at my work carefully enough. No, you should be speaking to their phenomena and making those potential linkages.
A lot of your later works were in collaboration with your PhD students at Wharton. I'm sure a number of PhD students sitting here would love to know, what do you look for in a PhD student when you start working with them?
So what do I look for? So Jim would probably see, they find me, I don't find them. Okay, so I'm in my office doing whatever it is I do in my distracted life, and they knock on the door. Oftentimes in that knocking at the door to be, maybe, oh, Dan, well, more likely, let me pitch how I'm interested in what you're doing. And after about 2 cents of that, I generally stop and say, okay, tell me what you're interested in. You've made this irrational choice to become a PhD student. You have some underlying passion that made you go that way. Let me understand and hear a little about that. And yes, we need to find some common ground. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot of point in having a conversation. But I kind of put on that brakes of, isomorphic, pleasing inclinations to tell me about your deep interest, and can they articulate that? And if the fourth or fifth sentence is about how they're going to be able to generate a paper about this, that's a turnoff, okay? I feel like this is a dating kind of question, okay? So, no, I want you to talk about what's animating you about ideas and how we might go explore that.
We actually have 2 quotes from your students
Okay.
that I'm probably going to go there and fix the video and show to all of the audience. Then, so, yeah. So this is the poetic ones. So Sandil said, as a mentor, then always strike the right balance between treatment selection, which is walking the line between smothering with advice and giving enough rope to hang oneself. He has been a role model for me in my own advising of doctoral students. And Giovanni asked me a bunch of questions about which is the aspect I want from him, because he can say a lot of things about Dan. And I asked him to be as personal as he can, so this is what I get. He said, if you ask me what's the best memory of my Wharton days are, I would certainly say my weekly meeting with Dan, which is where I really developed myself as a scholar, not only intellectually, but also ethnically, because Dan is what I would define a purist. I have particularly warm memories of the period leading to our ASQ piece. In that period, we pushed hard, really hard. If I had to use a metaphor to describe these meetings, I would say that entering Dan's office was like entering a particle accelerator. Not that I particularly well what happened inside a particle accelerator, but that's the image that comes to mind when I think about it. You get drawn into a vortex that brings you to a different, pure, and very abstract space where much of thinking happens.
Very nice.
Very nice.
That's poetry.
So the serious work you did with Sandu S. Raj and Nikolai Sigolkov sort of signaled your focus from the interaction between organizations and environment into organizational design. So was that a deliberate transition?
Specifically, so, and Sandel's a lovely example of kind of walking in my office. He's all energized about modularity. It's a hot topic in that context. And I expressed my kind of curmudgeon, yes, but where the heck do these modules come from, and why do we presume that Ulrich and Eppinger have gotten it right, or where there's where's that design element? And so those conversations, that effort kind of posed the design sensibility. And I think, it's funny, I mean, Jim, enjoys the pathology and is very is very playful, less interested in the design. I was noting this morning at a different session, part of that contrast with Simon versus is March, where Simon is more of that kind of engineering sensibility, and not that I am in the anywhere near the where those two planets are floating, but sort of somewhere, but a kind of more intermediate perhaps sensibility. But yeah, both. The interaction with Senda, with Nikolai, we were kind of puzzled by actually underlying phenomena. This at the time of the exciting .com boom. Organizations were making big choices about, we need a separate e-commerce unit and so on. And it struck us, okay, we get that as an interesting way to begin to become innovative, but ultimately, everything you do is going to be e-commerce. Ultimately, this has to be integrated. So we actually initially had a very applied phenomena-based kind of curiosity, and then we got, seduced or whatever, preoccupied with some of the underlying theoretical mechanisms, and did those two theory papers.
Because Dan mentioned our profession is basically a way of pursuing your own passion and allow a taste of diversity. And a lot of that diversity comes from working with amazing colleagues, as you mentioned. So the work with Giovanni Gavatti, and he already described how it felt to be working on those pieces. So would you sort of describe and share with us about the ideas?
So Giovanni came to Wharton having been pre-socialized and trained by Franco Malerba at Bocconi, so already predisposed to think, and Franco gave Sid and I heads up, this wonderful guy is coming. And he kind of marched into my office early on. Evolutionary theory lacks cognition, and it should have it. Okay, that's actually a really good point. We've been dealing with these stimulus response learning. Can we kind of begin to take this on? So, Giovanni had that wonderful passion, and has that wonderful passion. And yeah, it was something I was kind of quite happy and recognized, as he articulated, yeah, that is an enormous void. Can we begin to make some progress? And did what became the ASQ paper, and then he, with his great field work on Polaroid, with Mary Tripsis, and then, looked at that work empirically as well. So it's a nice example of that strong, distinct perspective that I got seduced by, or luckily was able to co-work with a talented doctoral student.
Before we take some questions from the audience, we'd just like to hear your words on where you see the field is going. So I have two questions related to that. One is, you're a descendant of the behavioral school, and you alluded to it earlier with open innovation and open information. In the times of today, do you see some assumptions of behavioral school that need to adapt, and any new questions that scholars could ask from it?
So in some sense, all this flux and change stuff, right, is wonderful news for the behavioral school, right? You're in these unstable environments, so the rhetoric and interest around sustained competitive advantage kind of loses a little saliency, and so these issues of learning, adaptation, kind of are, always there. But I think the context is kind of giving them extra energy. So a good season for the behavioral world. I think maybe part of maybe that context. We're in this world of big data and so on. How does that change things? And it strikes me as interesting. If you look at, so how is that currently being applied? It's being applied on a kind of fairly operational level by the Amazons and the Googles of the world doing machine learning. Okay, they're behavioral. They're not using it to solve operations research problems now with better data. They're getting rich data, quick feedback, being able to run experiments, figuring out what ads to throw you, and so on. I think it's an interesting open question. Okay, those are very tactical kinds of choices. I don't think we'd call that strategy. To what extent do those big data machine learning processes perhaps migrate up? I think it's a kind of an interesting open question. But again, very consonant with a behavioral approach. I mean, actually, if you think about the early work going on in Carnegie, Simon leaves these studies of organizations to basically help found AI. So I mean, this kind of interplay is always been there. But I think at the same time, a challenge for organization studies is to understand organizations as multi-level system. It's not this, unitary actor bootstrapping through big data. And so Simon could do, the expert systems are different, is a different issue than the representation of the organizations. But I think it's a good time for the behavioral tradition and opportunities.
And one final question, you've mentioned that the decision to become a strategy professor is basically to resolve the economics versus OBE issue, the debate, and you yourself have sort of brought different worlds together in your works. But right now, do you think there are any current debates within the strategy field that need to be resolved?
I'm fairly eclectic and I guess a pragmatist. I'm not kind of a big ideologue. So I don't know, is it a dark secret here? I mean, or a thing I should be ashamed of? I've done in the past and just recently did another rational choice model. So I'm not morally opposed to that as a mode of inquiry. So so maybe my continued outsider sensibility. So I in that sense, I don't resonate that part of the question. I mean, if I see an issue, it's less about contestation of theoretical premise. Frankly, what I'm more troubled or concerned about is a kind of sensibility and essentially the publication fetish. Okay, that all the energy around kind of building the Vita and all our tutorials about how to manage that process and so on. And I guess so. The extent that I get kind of impassioned and ideological is more in that more process sense. And so for me, back to the irrational commitment to this journey, a Marchian sort of sensibility, you do good work by asking interesting questions and try to make traction on them. The article is a byproduct of that effort. If the article is the goal in view, I don't think the odds of doing something interesting are all that high. You may actually get an article, but bear in mind what the modal citation is to or the citation is to the modal article in our field. It's rather modest. So my concerns or angst are less about, are the game theorists, banging at the gates of my fortress or something, than more as a general, what is the nature of the intellectual engagement in the community, and as kind of some of the near-term selection pressures and feedbacks of our systems, and so Europe becomes more like North America. That's sort of good, but also sort of bad, right? In terms of kind of some of these issues. So my concerns are more of that sort than kind of the specific contestation about intellectual tribal wars.
Right, so I'm gonna take the prerogative. I have the means of production. I'm gonna ask the first one, but just a direct follow-up to what you were just saying, because you just founded a strategy journal, and you're someone who thinks about design. I'm curious, in founding that journal, if you thought at all, are there things you're doing to try to speak to this curiosity?
Yeah, great question, and I'm gonna have to come to the journal. Thank you, Ted. So, as part of design, and I take part of the Ari Lewin design for organization science. So I am an old enough scholar to remember when that was a startup. Okay, like, wow, Ari, really? You think that the world needs another journal? Seeing that maybe Jim always catty line was, the shortage of ideas, not the shortage of outlets. But Ari was willing to take some chances and so on. I think part of it, and that interesting design, and replicated with strategy science, which is fairly flat. So 10 wonderful senior editors. I feel like I can make a pretty good match between the manuscript and their expertise. And then that allows them to be editors, not like, oh, you got 3 reviews. That's interesting. Some like it, some don't. Make them happy. My pitch is reviews are really important, but they're important to your editorial judgment. And, we can disagree with their editorial judgment and so on, but I think that's really, really critical element in allowing that kind of, is it interesting? And then maybe I'll add one more, element to that kind of consideration. Broadly, there's is there insight and do we believe it? Okay, so there's sort of the technical correctness question, and is this interesting? And sort of over the years, in my org science role, I found reviewers are much more energized on the technical correct question. Our technical appropriateness, do we believe it? The senior editors, okay, fine, but does anybody care? And I think I'm trying to further reinforce that do we care sensibility. And as a boutique journal with a flat structure, I think we'll be able to do that, I hope.
Great, thanks.
You spoke about those contrasting sensibilities. You've used the term quite a bit. How can we enliven sort of strong sensibilities that that will inspire us in the ways you've described, as opposed to the institutional and other pressure that seem to bland us down?
Wow, so I can have my biases, but how do we make it part of the broader fabric? That's a really hard question. I mean, I think we, senior scholars making personnel decisions, are you really counting about kind of the ideas and impact, and are you willing to truly embrace those sensibilities? Because, certainly the easiest thing is counting how many bullet points on the Vita. So, I guess I am just appealing to further irrationality. I'm not sure, and on the margin I can operate through, as a senior scholar, letter writer, and journal creator, to create vehicles and influence context a little bit. But, if you get, yes, you can't completely neglect instrumentality, but, as you go further down that path, McKinsey pays better, okay? And I guess my pitch is, think about yourself as having a career, not a job in a particular institution. Yes, you're in that institution, you want to be part of it, you want to contribute, you don't feel like a short timer, and maybe in fact it will be of a long duration. But I think sometimes, the energy around that and the persistence of a particular role may cause you to make choices that maybe you're not ultimately all that happy with. But one needs to, much like exploitation, you need a paycheck, you need to survive in the near term while you pursue these loftier ambitions. And I think also, as one pursues a lofty ambition, not to be self-indulgent. Okay, do the hard work. Can you operationalize these ideas? Can you actually get to empiricism? Can you get to actually a more articulated theory, and not just give us, not just kind of tease the world? So, a lovely question, with a very incomplete answer.
Yeah, but I wanted to follow up on the theory bit, because you seem to do both formal theory and computational, but you really have been there at the beginning with computational theory modeling coming. I'm just curious what your impression of where that stands in the sort of range of management and strategy approaches and where you think it's going?
You know, there seems to be some spread. Again, I'm not, not a militant advocate for its kind of growth and proliferation. It's what I do. It's some of my friends, colleagues do. Actually, my own preference tend to be kind of bimodal. I mean, kind of between this very rich qualitative work and the computation. So it's growing. I think, how does one learn and train? It's still a bit of an art and craft. So we don't have, even in my work, we don't have a course on how you do that. You typically get socialized in formal modeling and take an econ course, which has some general useful socialization, but the specific tools, techniques are not probably what one would want to do. And, the sort of how to do that effectively, when the simplification is appropriate or not, is not a easy task. But I think it's fairly natural for this field, right? So why, particularly want to make the contrast between computational and closed form. So when you leave closed form and computational, basically, are the processes you're interested in have a high degree of path dependent? Is there a fair degree of stochastic elements? And what are the interactions? So if you think about kind of classic I/O, Dutch organization economics, you have two firms and two periods, okay? I can do a closed form model there. The state space is very conveniently finite. And if that's, entry barriers, and I can tell the story with two firms, two periods, that's great. But if the playing out of the process has a greater branching to it, it's not going to be a closed form model. I mean, Bellman, who develops dynamic programming, talked about the curse of dimensionality. And he's very quite conscious of sort of what's the nature of the state space that you're thinking about. And so I think there's a really natural movement in certain kinds of issues from the closed form to computational.
Hi, Dan.
Hi.
I was just wondering if there is an idea that currently exists out there that you wish that you would have thought about in the last 20 or 30 years.
Well, among my kind of, I've been a very blessed and fortunate life. I mean, I actually, it relates a little bit to this closed form computation. So as a first or second year PhD student, after Michael Cohen had me read Holland's work, I had this idea of doing a bandit model under a survival constraint. Wealth mattered, and I thought, once wealth matters, if you start poor, the sort of basic intuition of bandit model, you start kind of clueless, you do lots of search, and you explore, then you hunker down and exploit. And I thought, I could actually get a flip of that, right? It's a startup firm. And so stupidly, but I don't know why Michael Cohen didn't correct me, but I thought I would do a closed, because I was trained by the economists, I needed to do a closed form solution of that. And so I was dealing with exploration data. This is a time date this is 1980. So I graduated college after 80. So it was 1980, 81. Couldn't crack it and off to do other things. And Michael should have said, Dan, you idiot. Why even do this? Here's how other people could kind of model that. So I don't know. I've had a very blessed life, but I kind of wish Michael kind of hit me over the head and told me, forget your closed form fetishing of your initial PhD training and deal with that computationally. I know that speaks to your question. But shows you imprinting effects. And it took about 20 years for Hart and I, then I'm working with Hart, and we actually do a bandit model in an appropriate way that spoke to a little bit of some of those issues.
And just a question on how much has intuition played in bringing together those disparate areas that you put together using that? How has intuition played into that in your opinion?
Quite a bit. So I don't, well, this is a dirty secret I shouldn't be revealing or something, but I'm not going to start a modeling kind of theory project until, in my head, I kind of have a sense of, oh, there's something interesting here. I think this is how it works. Now, you might then argue, well, why the heck even bother doing a model? Could you just be the verbal theorist? And I think there's two elements to that. One is maybe the legitimacies of the journal process, but more importantly is, I tend to be partly right, partly incomplete, maybe a little bit wrong. Okay, but I think back to your question is the research is not a discovery process. I'm like, oh, imagine I made these three assumptions and I put this in a soup can. What would happen? Right? No, I'm not. That seems to me not a particularly. And the degree that I've ever kind of gotten close to that, you end up working hard and doing mediocre stuff. And again, but it's not as if my intuition is correct, but it is a guide to action, right? In some ways, a little bit like Gabriel's work on your work on kind of thinking about managerial vision and kind of the strategy and process. So these suggestive guides of action are really quite important. And over the year, one has developed pretty good but incomplete intuition. But that is the exact, that's the initial kind of trigger to doing the work.
I was just wondering, what do you think your greatest contribution to the strategy
field is? First of all, am I a strategy guy? I slowly got, I still have this identity, okay, your work guy. But if one took the objective data about impact of specific papers, then one would go with absorb capacity. I think from a more general aesthetic of kind of blending the economic and the behavioral, trying to think about the organization and the industry environment as kind of this dual system way, that's obviously not unique to me, but I think I've made some contributions to sort of help develop that kind of sensibility and help develop the community of scholars engage in that. And that's back to me maybe not being ideological, that, can you draw in a powerful way from some of these kind of traditions in a kind of more, somewhat more integrative way, right, versus strategy. And I think, one of the many challenges of the strategy field, it's less of a challenge for us as academics, more as in our instructor role, right? It's this kind of mosaic. And as academics, okay, fine, I'm going to do Henry Mintzberg, you're going to do Porter, we don't have to talk to each other, it's all good. But imagine you walk into an MBA classroom, you have to be somewhat coherent and a little more integrated. And I think, on the margin, try to make some efforts to a little bit do that. So I find the evolutionary perspective very powerful, but can we bring some modicum of intentionally design with that as a broader framework? And so I'm more engaged on that sort of less the specific contribution, but a kind of broader sensibility of that sort. Some the Nelson and Winter imprint, the Jim Marsh, these other kind of imprints getting recombined a little bit in that manner.
So a lot of your work embraces the complexity of strategy issues, right, and acknowledges the limits of actors in dealing with that complexity. And you were mentioning a bit before that you recently used the rational actor model for some other issues. I was wondering, in which areas of our field are we safe, assuming that actors are rational?
So, as Simon noted, in the early 50s, the two scissors of rationality. There's the mind doesn't change, the context changes, right? So, if the context is some rational expectation game that involves kind of end deep, I think, you think, so on, seems a little bit of a stretch, okay? That's going to be played out in this kind of, Spock-like magic between two minds in the ether. But something I think in some ways in our infatuation with kind of very elaborate game theoretic stuff, we sometimes, okay, cost matters, competition matters, okay? That's a pretty basic fact about the world. I think it's okay to approach some of those considerations in a pretty simple, more neoclassical manner. The paper Sid and Torberg-Knudsen and I have about industry dynamics is a little bit of a hybrid. They're making rational choices, but from a kind of somewhat myopic problem context. They're not thinking about the full dynamic equilibrium. I think those papers are quite useful. I think they actually are hard because they're offensive to everybody, right? The economist says, oh, but really, these actors are being myopic. Yes, they did something kind of calculative, but why did they think about that whole game tree? And then for behavioralists, it's sort of offensive because, in fact, they were making a rational choice. But it actually seems to me, for many contexts like that, actually a kind of a useful structure that in reasonably well-defined short runs, there could be rational calculus. So we put in enough spatial and temporal boundedness to the problem. Rational calculus is a reasonable approximation. As the interdependencies at a point in time, and maybe even more and equally problematic across time, get amplified, that's going to be a less appropriate representation.
As a PhD student in entrepreneurship, I would like to ask you something really related to entrepreneurship. So basically, I have an opinion that scholarship in this area has a lot of similarities with entrepreneurship, and you have to pursue opportunities. But as in reality, you may spot the right opportunities, but also the exploitation process may ultimately show you that some of the opportunities that you spotted led you to some wrong discoveries. And as a takeaway of that, I would like to ask you of an example of a paper that you regret writing, and an example of a paper that you regret not writing.
Right. I struggle with the challenge of finite time and opportunity cost. Okay, much as any diversified firm would. Okay, so one is never going to get that right. And so, what was the latent use of time, and was that the best use of time? Which is a somewhat different statement, a more modest statement. Did I regret that I did it? Like, oh, am I now embarrassed by it? Maybe I should be, but offhand, I'm not. I'm not ashamed. As my friends here noted me, and you realize, I'm easily seducible, which is in some ways a good thing. I've been blessed being surrounded by great colleagues and PhD students, and I've been much more productive and had a lot more fun because of that. So I'm not quite. I still struggle at this point in life with managing, and maybe because it gets harder at this point in life for me, the opportunity cost problem. So I'm giving you a non-specific, softer answer to that issue, but it is a ongoing issue. I have trouble saying no. It's a seduction element, and because they're all good, but then there's this finiteness. But I'm not, well, they help me realize some underlying themes of continuity more than I appreciated. Like, you made me realize my work with Mark Fitchman kind of fit into my adaptation selection better than I was kind of conscious of. So my therapists here have done a good job of kind of seeing these but in ways that are good, maybe, certainly less than optimal, kind of happenstance kind of pulls me, but for better or worse, I don't operate with a high level of design and intention. I embrace my own myopia.
faced with the terminology industry evolution, it always prompted me, what's the very cause of industry innovation? I'm sure you're one of the outstanding scholars in such a field, I know. So I want to get some ideas about what's the very cause of industry innovation. Without such topics, we cannot explain why Nokia and Kodak just collapsed. I think that's why. 5 years ago, I have written for my book, why industry hegemony shifts. So when I deal with it, that's the one of the point I have to really trouble nobody. So I really want you to get some ideas from you. Thank you.
Okay, so I first thought of your line of question in one way, and then the latter comments have made me think about it differently. So let me cover my bases and do a little bit of both. So your latter set of comments, as I understand it, why the Schumpeterian dynamics, why this kind of turnover, and so on. And I think per that, why I feel my own, I'm not going to be biased here, but these issues of challenge of origin adaptation, change, path dependence are clearly fundamental mechanisms to help us understand that. And how feedback mechanisms indeed, and part of the myopia of learning, may prompt firms to be subject to some of these challenges and not perhaps persist. The first part of your question, I thought you were, and maybe you did intend both, I thought was a kind of, or I think you were kind of, I feel like you offer interesting critique of a lot of the ways we approach it. So often industry evolution is, in the beginning there was a demand curve. And then the little guys kind of jumped into the sandbox, some got bigger, some got smaller, some got pushed out. Right? We have the shakeout. But we take as exogenous the sort of the context. And so it's typically a very one-sided examination of the evolutionary dynamics. It's really purely on the supply side. I think the issue of pushing more on the biological, think about niche space, opens up, there's your models are always something that's going to be exogenous, but allows a broader consideration. I mean, I did a paper a number of years ago on the evolution of wireless technology and how this technology enters kind of different application domains. And so we didn't have this sort of fixed demand curve. There are some interest and needs of functionality, but even those are changing with complementary technological changes. But treating it in a more open systems kind of manner. And I think certainly most of our treatments of industry evolution tend to be fairly closest to models for the obvious reasons that that's simpler. And yeah, so I'll just leave it at that. But I think you pose in that sense a kind of important challenge for a lot of our conceptualizing in that way to be engaged in those kinds of questions.
I just wanted to ask you a question. I mean, in sort of your distinguished trajectory, and sort of we are now celebrating the result of it. There were obviously some moments with drama, and especially in the publication process, trying to communicate the ideas and so on. So can you share with us perhaps what you would consider to be the most dramatic moment going forward, and perhaps its triumph in that respect?
I mean, I made a very early on choice that had consequence. So back to this childhood kind of stuff. So I'm in a PhD program. It's about agency theory. I'm a research assistant with Bob Wilson, Kenneth Arrow. I do this survey of agency model. And actually, the dissertation, in fact, probably may have been the first paper about two-sided moral hazard. And so I'm kind of doing this, but then that's not quite me. I'm in this other context, and partly being seduced. Wes and I are starting to talk about this stuff.
Mark Fitchman and I were talking about this stuff, and I did the total career suicide stupid move, okay? I said, you know what? I really don't want to go back to the dissertation topic. You know, yes, I've got these reviews, I do it, opportunity cost, whatever, emotional engagement. You know, this is not a normative statement, it's a descriptive statement about my choice. But I left my dissertation in the hard drive, except for the essay, the survey thing that I did for Arrow and Wilson. And just, you know what? I'm going to follow kind of what I'm excited about at that time and interest. I think it was probably off-putting to some economists at Carnegie. But, I thought we hired economists. What happened to them? You know, you have careers. It's not about the job. So that was also very, you know, maybe my own foolishness, naivete, outsider, whatever, kind of liberating, right? So I care what people think, but because that's feedback, okay? And I want to do better work and learn. But that's different than normative isomorphism. And for whatever stubborn and foolish, you know, probably in some ways career destructive choices, you know. So, but that was, you know, well, it wasn't an obvious choice, and it wasn't obviously that kind of. It wasn't obvious. It made a lot of sense. You know, the first version of Absorbed Capacity was just the model, and we sent it out to Rand. Rand Journal said, kind of interesting, but really you need a little more game theory for us to like this. And then Wes realized, you know, he and Dave Mary have been doing all this empirical work. We could actually link what we were talking about to that empirical work. So round two, it becomes this economic journal article that they decided it's one of their 13 most important. So, you know, there is that entrepreneurial, Jim would say, kind of stubbornness, slow learner, obstinance. But I think, but you don't want to be delusional. Okay, back to the world is telling you something. There is a message. If I get an article rejected, when I tell other people, I always say, basically treat that like an R&R without the long, boring memo to the reviewers. It's a learning opportunity. You can be annoyed at the reviewers if they didn't appreciate your wisdom and insight, but ultimately you have to recognize you did not express the work in a way that's sufficiently compelling for them to see the insight. That's your bet. Okay? You ultimately have to express it with the clarity and power that other people see it. And so, you know, I'm comfortable being hard on myself, and maybe I'm just possessive, sufficiently set up for this profession that offers these opportunities for others, you know, not even self-flagellation. But in any case, that was kind of a early, irrational kind of choice, and complete foolishness to take the academic position that I did.
So if there's no more questions, I would probably conclude with a personal question. So we've seen Dan's work
already.
Yeah. Yes. We've seen Dan's work throughout, and we've been discussing to him about how this whole core of him is always there consistently, and with all these inspirations from all other people and exciting colleagues in your life. And we've talked about how this whole organization design concepts and also organization itself as complex adaptive system comes actually quite earlier with the work with Barklin. And then about, you know, how your early experimentation with the bandit model later turned to be a work with Hart-Posen. So I'm thinking, you know, if you can give any advice or suggestions to the junior faculty members who are still exploring now, that might later become some of your inspiration also. So do you have any words for them?
Well, you know, we've kind of already chatted with my kind of encouragement to sort of follow those intellectual interests and passion, and again, in a way that connect to real life outcomes, but to be a bit ambitious. And you know, yes, you're drawing from prior work, but prior work is always incomplete. So early doctoral student who he'd go off and then he'd say, oh, but X has kind of said this. And yes, you can read into and find somewhere. And you don't want to ignore the past. You're building on it. You acknowledge it, but then you kind of extend and go from there. So we'll be ambitious and not be intimidated. But we're really blessed. I mean, what a wonderful job. Yes, grading Blue Books is not so exciting, but there's this other piece of what we get to do. Incredible freedom and opportunity, and take advantage of that.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, sure, too.
I mean, you referred to this as a therapy session, and that you learn a lot about the process.
Yeah.
So I wonder, what have you learned?
Well, I think they helped me see more elements of continuity in some of the underlying threads of the work than being in the thick of it than I kind of appreciate. But I liken it to, when you come up for tenure full professor, you've got to write these research statements, right? And you're kind of, oh, you know what? Actually, the stuff does say, there's a normative pressure to make things look like they hang together. But then in the middle of writing, you realize, oh, these actually do link. And I felt like this was sort of like a further grown-up version of that kind of exercise. Okay, let's go back and see the strands. It was really quite a pleasure to have that opportunity.
So, would you have written your statement differently?
This has helped me write. If I have to write one today, they've helped me kind of do a better job. And I haven't looked back at the old statements, but probably yes.